The early days of Second El Alamein produced one of the most difficult situations an attacking army can face: success that was real, costly, and not yet decisive. Montgomery's Eighth Army had entered the Axis defensive system, seized ground, and forced Rommel's forces to respond. The opening barrage had shaken the line, infantry had crossed parts of the minefields, and engineers had worked under fire to open lanes. Yet the great breakthrough had not come. British armor had not poured into open desert behind the Axis position, and the enemy defense had not collapsed. This episode matters because a break-in without a breakthrough is more exhausting than it sounds. It tempts commanders to keep feeding strength forward because stopping feels like wasting what has already been paid for. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The problem began with the nature of the Axis defenses. The German and Italian line at El Alamein had depth, which meant that the first positions were not the whole position. Minefields, wire, strong points, gun lines, and reserves were arranged so that an attacker who overcame one layer could be caught by another. Depth gave the defenders time to recover from surprise. It also created uncertainty for the attackers, who might believe they had reached the decisive point, only to discover another belt, another defended rise, or another anti-tank screen beyond it. In a fluid desert battle, movement might quickly become exploitation. At El Alamein, movement was swallowed by depth. The Eighth Army could get inside the enemy line, but getting through it was a different and much harder matter. For the infantry, the early battle was a succession of limited objectives that were anything but limited to the men taking them. Australian, New Zealand, South African, Highland, and other British and Commonwealth troops pushed into the Axis defenses, often in darkness and under heavy fire. They captured positions, reorganized, dug in, and waited for support that might arrive late or be blocked by mines and traffic. Holding captured ground demanded endurance because the enemy rarely accepted a lost position quietly. Shellfire continued, counterattacks developed, and wounded men had to be moved back through dangerous routes. The infantry's progress made the offensive possible, but it did not automatically open the battlefield for tanks. That gap between human foothold and armored passage became the battle's central frustration. For the armored formations, the situation was equally difficult in a different way. Tank crews had prepared for a major battle, but many found themselves waiting, moving slowly through lanes, or deploying into cramped ground where the enemy's anti-tank system still had teeth. An armored division is built for movement and concentration, but the minefields reduced movement and broke concentration. Tanks that did reach forward areas often could not fan out freely. They faced guns that had survived the barrage and defenders who knew where the lanes were likely to emerge. The Eighth Army had more tanks than the Axis, but superiority in numbers did not mean superiority at the point of contact if those tanks arrived in disorder, one group at a time, into prepared fire. This is where the battle revealed a hard truth about plans. Operation Lightfoot had been carefully prepared, but a plan can be sound in concept and still fail to achieve its full intention on schedule. Infantry had advanced, engineers had cleared some lanes, artillery had fired, and the army had not broken apart. Those were achievements, yet the timing between infantry success and armored exploitation slipped. Lanes took longer to open than expected, and some were too narrow, confused, or blocked for the flow of vehicles required. Reports from the front did not always match conditions on the ground. Commanders had to decide whether to push on, pause, redirect, or reinforce, while the enemy was making decisions of his own. Rommel was absent at the very start of the offensive, recovering from illness in Europe, and command initially fell to General Georg Stuma, whose sudden death during the battle added confusion on the Axis side. Rommel soon returned, but he came back to a front already under severe pressure. The Axis problem was not only tactical. Their fuel shortage limited how freely reserves could move. Allied air power made movement harder. Communications were disrupted, and the line was being hammered by artillery and local attacks. Yet the defenders still had enough skill, discipline, and prepared firepower to prevent an easy British success. This is important because the early battle was not a story of British failure against a weak enemy. It was a story of partial British success against a defense that still functioned. The German and Italian response relied heavily on local counterattacks and anti-tank resistance. Axis armor could not afford reckless movement, but it could strike where British gains threatened important ground. Anti-tank guns, including the famous 88s and many smaller weapons, turned forward areas into dangerous places for British armor. Italian units held sectors of the line and suffered heavily under the weight of the offensive, and their role should not be erased by later stereotypes. The Axis defensive system worked by forcing the British to pay repeatedly for each advance. Even when positions were lost, the defenders tried to make the loss expensive enough to slow the next step. That was exactly what a defense in depth was meant to do. Montgomery now faced the commander's dilemma created by incomplete success. If he stopped too soon, he risked allowing the Axis to stabilize the line and claim that the offensive had failed. If he rushed armor forward without conditions, he risked repeating older British mistakes and losing tanks against anti-tank guns in confused ground. If he shifted the main effort too abruptly, he might waste the pressure already built in the north. The answer he chose was not a dramatic gamble, but continued pressure. He would keep trying to crumble the Axis line, wear down reserves, and create a better opportunity for a renewed breakthrough. This decision reflected his view of battle as a controlled process rather than a single throw of dice. That process required logistics on a massive scale. Every day of fighting consumed shells, fuel, water, food, medical supplies, minesweeping equipment, tank tracks, engines, radios, and human strength. The Eighth Army could continue because it had accumulated the means to continue. Trucks carried ammunition forward, workshops repaired damaged vehicles, recovery crews salvaged tanks, and staff officers tried to keep roads and tracks from choking. A partial success becomes dangerous if an army cannot sustain it, because forward troops are then left exposed without the means to deepen or protect their gains. Montgomery's advantage was that his army could keep feeding the battle more reliably than Rommel's could. Attrition favored the side with deeper reserves and better supply. The psychological strain of the break-in was severe. Soldiers had been told, directly or indirectly, that this battle had been prepared with unusual care, and that the Eighth Army now possessed overwhelming strength. When the first nights did not produce a clean breakthrough, disappointment and frustration were natural. Men at the front could see only their own narrow sector, a ridge not fully secured, a lane still blocked, a tank burning nearby, a counterattack forming in dust. Commanders behind the line had to hold together a broader view. They had to understand that the absence of immediate breakthrough did not mean defeat. The battle was shifting from the hope of rapid penetration to the reality of wearing the enemy down. For the Axis troops, the early days were also exhausting and frightening. The British attack did not simply bounce off the defenses. It pressed into them, forced movement, cut up positions, and subjected frontline units to relentless artillery and air pressure. A defender in a strong point might hold, but he might also be isolated, short of ammunition, or uncertain whether neighboring positions still existed. Axis commanders had to choose where to commit scarce reserves, knowing that every counterattack used fuel and exposed vehicles. The British were frustrated because they had not broken through. The Axis were strained because they had not thrown the British out. The battle was becoming a contest of endurance, and endurance was increasingly a British strength. In the history of armored warfare, this phase of El Alamein is especially valuable because it punctures the myth of the clean breakthrough. Armored doctrine often imagines a rupture in the front, followed by exploitation into the enemy rear. That can happen, and when it does, it can transform a campaign. But between the first assault and the open road lies a harder reality. Mines, guns, traffic jams, uncertain reports, exhausted infantry, delayed engineers, and tanks unable to deploy. El Alamein shows that breakthrough is not a moment created by tanks alone. It is a condition produced by the failure of the enemy's defensive system, and systems often fail slowly before they fail suddenly. The early battle, therefore, deserves to be understood on its own terms, not merely as a delay before the famous outcome. The Eighth Army had not achieved the swift armored exploitation Montgomery wanted, but it had achieved a foothold inside Rommel's line. It had forced the Axis to fight under conditions that consumed their limited strength. It had proven that the British and Commonwealth forces could sustain an offensive rather than collapse after the first difficulty. At the same time, it had exposed the limits of planning and the stubborn power of mines and anti-tank defense. A break-in without breakthrough was painful because it was ambiguous. It could become failure, or it could become the necessary first stage of victory.
The answer would depend on whether Montgomery could turn frustration into pressure. He had the artillery, reserves, supply, and command authority to keep attacking, but he also had to avoid wasting his armored force in the very killing zones the Axis had prepared. The battle would now move into a phase of crumbling, a deliberate attempt to grind down the enemy's positions and reserves until the line could no longer hold. This was not the desert war of sweeping maneuvers and dramatic flanking columns. It was a battle of depth, attrition, and method. The Eighth Army had broken into the Axis defense. Now it had to prove that it could remain there, widen the breach, exhaust the counterblows, and transform a costly foothold into the opening of the road west.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.